Well, here we go. Deck 78.
Well, tonight we're turning Deck 78 into a balcony with Stephen Melching, Ashley Miller, Darren Docterman, myself, Mark A. Altman, because, of course, we're talking about the new book about Siskel and Ebert, Opposable Thumbs, How Siskel and Ebert Changed Movies Forever. And welcome back to Deck 78, the pop culture podcast from the producers of the 4:30 movie and Inglorious Treksperts. Hey, guys, I'm excited about tonight.
Me too.
Pull up a chair, grab a drink, and shut the hell up.
No, and throw on a copy of Beyond the Valley of the Dolls. Can you imagine a film critic now? I guess Jay Cox wrote Strange Days and did, but he did some good movies. But a film critic, and he had a lot of comments on Star Wars and he hung out with that crowd. But could you imagine a major film critic writing a movie these days?
To be honest, I don't know that Ebert wrote a major movie, so
it was for Fox. We'll have to have Asbel come on and do commentary.
That'd be amazing, actually.
But are there any major film critics anymore? I don't know if we have any national film critics that have the kind of reach that Siskel and Ebert had.
Such a great point, Steve. There really isn't, is there?
No, because there's a huge, there's a huge market of them, and everybody has an opinion, and everybody has a platform. And yes, Siskel and Ebert were, they were not film historians, who were talking about things academically. They were just guys who were smart, who knew how to write, and who love films. But there's a lot of that now. And it's funny, I was thinking about this episode in the context of the 4:30 movie, and my excitement for getting into this episode, because we all do. We all love talking about movies. And I think the thing that as we kind of get into it, but the thing that's special about Siskel and Ebert is that they love movies in a very particular way. They love to talk about everything. It's such an eclectic experience watching that show. And I think that, to me, has always been the fun of just recording 4:30 movie. Except in our case, it's four guys who've got very different opinion, very different tastes. We talk about all kinds of things, everything from Cloak and Dagger to Crawl. So, we run.
I like the alliteration there.
Yeah, thank you. But it's just, I'm excited about this episode.
I mentioned this on Inglorious Treksperts once, and it's probably worth, for us, I think Siskel and Ebert loomed so large in our lives growing up and nurturing our love of our passion for film as teenagers, as college students. And I remember, when Rob and I did our first movie, Free Enterprise, my dream was to have it reviewed by Siskel and Ebert. And it should have been, because obviously it came out theatrically the same weekend as Phantom Menace. But what happened was, because it was based in Chicago, and one of our actors' fathers was a Chicago sports anchor, right, who was not particularly liked. I don't know if it was Siskel or Ebert, but one of them really didn't like him. That they decided not to review the show on Siskel and Ebert because they didn't like Tim Weigel.
Right. Oh my God.
It was heartbreaking not to have the film reviewed on Siskel and Ebert, because that was like part of the dream. You're making your first movie, and it's like, in our case, we made it with our childhood idol, William Shatner, and all these great things that were happening with it and winning all these awards. And then to have it rejected by Siskel and Ebert over this petty thing.
Well, and Mark, to be fair, you should have thought of that when you cast the movie.
yeah, had we known, right? Exactly. And it was heartbreaking. Although I have to say, in retrospect, I think this was all going on right at the time of Gene's illness.
I think Gene died in February of '99, I think. So maybe a little bit before Free Enterprise came out, but probably during the period when you're trying to do the promotion for it.
Because I think that he used to babysit for Rafer.
Who did?
I think he used to babysit for Rafer.
Oh, wow.
Gene or Gene's daughter or something. It was like there was a weird history, but Roger really had it out for Tim, I guess. Oh. And so he just, and I remember our publicists were like, couldn't believe it, because it's like, why would you? It's so up Roger's alley, and he just didn't want to have anything.
I mean,
to do with it.
I just want to see it. I just want to see a movie about, being babysat by Gene Siskel.
Yeah. Right? What's that like? Especially Steve, if you're ready for a while. I mean, that's crazy pants.
Steve, you posted something recently on Twitter, now X, about how you can watch all these old Siskel and Ebert episodes, and talking about something going viral. I mean, you got thousands of likes. It's amazing how Siskel and Ebert continue to be a huge part of the cultural conversation, even after they both passed away.
Well, they clearly had such an impact on a generation. I mean, when did you guys first discover Siskel and Ebert? When did you start watching them? Do you remember?
79. Mm-hmm. 79 on WTTW.
I watching, I think in 78, because I remember my mom or my dad telling me, there's these film critics on PBS that review movies. You might like this. Yeah. And I started watching it religiously. And I followed them wherever they went. I even watched the spinoffs, after they left. Those all as long as I could stomach it, with the other critics who were just terrible.
Rex Reed and Michael Medved and all those.
And arguably almost as bad as when Roger had all these guest critics when Gene was on his hiatus. And I have to say, that is a heartbreaking part of the book. The book is so fun, going on Letterman, going on, the rivalry between the two of them. It's just delightful and funny. And all of a sudden it takes a turn, as you would expect, when Gene starts to get sick and is hiding it from everybody. And then he passes away, basically days after he records his final episode and says he's coming back. I mean, and then because I remember all that when Gene wasn't on the show, and everybody's like, when is he coming back? Because the show wasn't the same without him. And then after he passed away, Roger did the show with other people until he paired himself with Richard, and it was never the same after that.
Yeah.
I can't remember a time I wasn't watching that show. I think because I'm like you, we're all kind of the same. It was an opportunity to see these snippets of film, which was, to me, was so fascinating, because it was so difficult for me to get to go to the movies. It had to be a special event, but I was always drawn to them. I was so drawn to them that if I couldn't go see the movie, I would read the novelization. And it was just that taste. And it was always great hearing them talk about things, and they had such an impact on me in terms of how to talk about this stuff.
And he was a Pulitzer Prize winning writer, Ebert, and I'm sure you bought a couple of the books that he published, which was just terrific.
Yeah, I definitely discovered them during their sneak previews era, living in the DC area, probably the same area, same TV market as Ashley.
Yeah.
And my parents were not particular moviegoers, so I must have just stumbled across it on PBS one day, and I'd become a movie fanatic after the first Star Wars film came out, and here was this show that was on every week talking about movies, and I became a regular viewer at some point during the sneak previews run, and then just continued, like Mark, to watch them and their spinoffs for the next, 20 years. I followed them wherever they went.
Anything I could about movies. The other thing I alluded to in the interview is That's Hollywood, which Fox produced a lot of their movies, because at the end, the Death Star explodes. So even if it was a movie I wasn't interested in, I got to see the clip of the Death Star explode at the end, so it was all worth it. And the other time I would love is, most people would watch the Mets game or the Yankee games because they wanted to watch baseball. I would watch when it was rained out, because often they would put on these old documentaries about movies that would show up, during the rainouts. And I would love that, unless they preempted it with a movie. But sometimes it was drizzling and they didn't know how long, so they would throw on these documentaries. Now the making of the Searchers or whatever. And I used to love that. So, but Siskel and Ebert was a huge part. And I remember when I went to college, I sort of stopped watching them. But but I was still trying whenever I could, see the episodes. And so many movies. Like, before we bring on Matt, is there a film that they introduced to you that you fell in love with as a result of Siskel and Ebert, or favorite episode of the show, Steve, Mr. Monday?
Well, an episode that I always remember vividly, and I rewatched it on YouTube recently, was the one where they reviewed Full Metal Jacket, because they just had this legendary argument where I think Ebert liked it and Siskel liked it and Ebert didn't. Am I getting it mixed up? But they would not let it go. They kept coming back to it throughout the whole show and sniping at each other about their taste in that movie. But I don't think they ever dissuaded me from seeing a movie that I wanted to see, but they definitely encouraged me to see movies that I might not have been interested in otherwise. And probably one of them that I remember was Witness, Harrison Ford in Witness. I think they gave a great review to that. And I was 16 years old at the time, and that really wasn't quite my cup of tea. I was still more into Star Wars and James Bond and Schwarzenegger and stuff like that. But I thought, Harrison Ford is in this. It's a drama. I'll check it out. And I freaking loved it. It's a terrific movie.
Darren, you must have been really offended when they start bagging on Star Trek: The Motion Picture.
No, because they offended me every movie that I liked. One of my favorite episodes that I remember for the inanity of the comments was they reviewed Return of the Jedi, and Siskel says, "Well, I just can't figure out. They're riding these bikes through the forest. Why don't they just fly above the trees?"
Yeah.
What? Because that would lose all the drama of it, Gene.
Well, and their job was to patrol the forest, and you can't patrol the forest when you're above the canopy and can't see what's going on down there.
Inside the forest.
I always enjoyed watching their particular perspective on things that often differed with my own.
But do you remember the clip that they showed at the head of that show? Like, I always remember it's that clip when they're approaching the Super Star Destroyer.
Yeah.
And I just remember seeing that. That was maybe the first clip I saw of Return of the Jedi.
I don't know.
Before
Fly casual.
Yeah.
Well, the first time I saw clips from Star Trek 2 was on Siskel and Ebert.
Oh, yeah.
And I remember that, where, the phasers from the Reliant cut into the Enterprise, which is the first time you ever saw the Enterprise actually get hit and get battle damage. And that blew my mind. It blew my mind.
Yeah.
I could not, my head was going to explode.
Magical.
What about you, Ashley? Siskel and Ebert, a moment that was particularly impactful for you?
I want to say it was it was probably their best of 83 episode and Risky Business. Now, understand, I'm a little younger than you guys. I was 12 years old at the time. And Risky Business was probably out of my age range.
Yeah.
But that movie to me, I don't know how to describe it. It's like the way they talked about it, it looked so beautiful, and it is a beautiful film.
It is beautiful looking. Unlike most teen exploitation, it is a beautiful looking film.
Absolutely. And I had to see it. And that was what really made me want to see it. And I remember, when it finally came out on video, and I mean, it must have been a year later or something like that. But I mean, I remember
it was on HBO every 3 seconds.
Yeah, but we didn't have HBO. So I had to go and wait. And I remember it was it might have been the first rated R movie that I rented from Errol's Video in my hometown of Manassas. And it just I remember that it was wow, this is a big deal. I feel like something adult is going to happen in this movie, but that was all because of that episode, and it just grabbed me, man.
Well, and plus they focused on it because of the Chicago connection, because it takes place in Chicago.
Yeah.
And
I hope the statute of limitations has run out, because I'm about to admit something. Risky Business was when I got the 2 VCRs and the Macrovision foiler. That was one of the first movies that we copied onto VHS from the video store. So hopefully the FBI is not going to come after me for admitting that I made an illegal copy of Risky Business.
There's something perfect about doing that.
13 years old or 14
Mark, Interpol has expressed concern over the copying of copyable discs.
Who's the U-boat commander?
No, Princeton is looking for some men like you, Mark.
Yeah.
So why don't we bring in our guest?
Let's bring in Matt Singer,
Let's open up the balcony.
Yep, let's open up the balcony. There's no skunk. There's no stinker of the week. There's only the author, Matt Singer, to talk to us about his wonderful new book, Opposable Thumbs. And we'll be back after the interview with a few brief closing remarks. And now we're joined by Matt Singer, the author of the new, I always hold the book up even though it's not a video, Opposable Thumbs, How Siskel and Ebert Changed Movies Forever. And as all great authors, he hails from Brooklyn, and we're delighted to have him on the show. And I got to tell you, I love this book. It was a great podcast I really enjoyed a couple of years ago called Roger and Gene, or Gene and Roger, I don't remember, but it was terrific. But this is an even deeper dive into the history of Siskel and Ebert and their legacy, and I just loved it. So I hope that it's finding a home, and you had a successful holiday season with the who published this? Putnam. That Putnam did well with the book, and that you'll see lots of royalties over the next couple of years. So what was the impetus for you, Matt, of writing this book? I mean, what sort of got you interested? And maybe that's a two-part question, but like, what got you interested in Siskel and Ebert initially? And then, of course, what prompted you to sort of pitch and write this book?
Well, the interest in them came from just being a huge dork and nerd and fan of the show as a kid, really. I mean, I grew up watching the show. Actually, like the period where I discovered the show is probably the period that I really got into Star Trek. I mean, I'm not the world's biggest a Trekspert, one might say, but I had the flirtation with being really, really into Star Trek.
Trek curious.
Yeah, exactly. Trek curious. And I would still consider myself a fan, just, certainly not an expert, and I haven't really kept up with everything. But it was around that age, was like 12, 13, 14 was the age where I started getting into things like Star Trek, and I got much more into comic books, which I was already sort of casually interested in. And another thing that I became obsessed with at that age was Siskel and Ebert. And I used to watch it. I grew up in New Jersey. Now I am in Brooklyn. That is true. But I grew up in New Jersey. And at that time, the show was very hard to watch, because we're talking the early 90s. There's no DVR. There's no, the internet is like a thing on the one large computer that's on my, that's downstairs, that you need a key to unlock the giant desk that my dad keeps it in. And you can sign on to AOL, and you can hang out with other X-Men nerds and pretend, you can have a sim of the X-Men, is what I remember doing at that age on the internet. But in any event, that was the time period where I became super into Siskel and Ebert. I couldn't really tell you why, because I wasn't super into movies at that age, actually. I liked movies, but it wasn't I love movies and I must learn more about them. It was more like, who are these two dudes who are kind of weird looking and wearing, V-neck sweaters that are on television, and every week they just yell about movies. This is a thing. And for some reason, it really captured my imagination at that age. Maybe just the sheer fact that they were so obviously dorks really spoke to me, because I guess I self-identified then and now as one. And so that was, what's that?
Well, I was going to say, what was interesting in the book too was that both Gene and Roger didn't necessarily start out as passionate movie fans either.
No.
That they evolved. And I always just assumed that was in their blood, at least certainly Roger. But they both discovered it later because they like journalism and they like writing. It's so interesting.
That's true. Yes. So then anytime someone says, well, you didn't know anything about movies and then you started watching this show, I was like, it's an easy retort, actually, because they didn't set out to be film critics. They never went to school for film criticism. I have a technically much better education in movies than they did, because I actually got a master's in cinema studies, something neither of them ever actually did. Not that I think I'm half the critic they were. Just saying, they never set out to be a film critic. They both sort of stumbled into their jobs, although Siskel worked for his a little bit harder in the sense that he actually kind of, when a job presented itself in front of him, he kind of campaigned to get it. Ebert literally never tried to be a film critic, and he was handed the job as a young guy who was just starting at the Sun-Times. It's pretty crazy. But to get back to your original question, so that was why I was obsessed with them. And then why write the book was sort of, I had written a couple of books and was looking for a new subject. And I was working with an agent for the first time, and he wanted me to send him ideas. And before I sent him my list of ideas, I showed it to my wife, and I was like, so here's what I'm thinking. What do you think? And she was the one who was like, well, why isn't Siskel and Ebert on here? Which it was not originally in this list. And I said, I mean, I don't know exactly the words exactly, but the reason was I was essentially intimidated by it because, as I explained, I was such a huge fan of the show. If I screwed it up, I would have, been. I mean, I guess screwing up anything would be bad, but screwing up the Siskel and Ebert book would have really upset me because I actually was such a fan and really cared, and I still do. I love the show, so I didn't want it to screw it up. And my wife was like, "Okay, fine. First of all, get over yourself. You're desperate you're looking for a compliment. You can do it. It's fine. You can handle it." And then the other thing she said was, if you don't write the book, someone else is going to do it eventually. And when that happens, you're going to be angry that you had your chance to do it and you didn't do it. And I was like, she's right. Damn it. She's right. I'm this petty and small that I would be pissed off.
Yeah. The worst. When the wives are
right. And it's a great motivator, pettiness and hatred. So that was it. That was
forever will they dominate your destiny.
Yeah. Siskel and Ebert went on the list. It got sent to the agent. The agent was like, Siskel and Ebert, that's the one. Do the proposal. And we were off and running.
What iteration of the show did you first become enamored with? Was it at the movies?
No, it was Siskel and Ebert, right? So it was the early 90s, which was by that point, they were Siskel and Ebert. I didn't know until years later that there were other versions of the show. I had no idea that they were on PBS, that technically there were 3 shows. They hosted 3 different TV shows that all had the exact same format on a set that almost looked identical.
Right.
Sneak previews at PBS. That's right. Which was originally called
WTTW.
At WTTW. It was originally called Opening Soon at a Theater Near You.
Right, that was their pilot.
So apparently somebody thought eventually, wait a minute, maybe we shouldn't have the longest title in history. And then that got shortened to sneak previews, and that's the way it remained until they left the show. The show actually continued without them for longer than they were with the show. The show continued into the early 90s with different hosts.
Right.
But they left for syndication, and then that version was the version that was called At the Movies with Gene Siskel and Roger Ebert. And then 4 years later, when that contract was up, that's when they jumped to a second syndication deal, a more lucrative one with Buena Vista Television, which is the syndication arm of Disney. And they stayed there until Siskel's death. And that was the version of the show that I was watching. So it's the early 90s. This is, if you vaguely remember the show, it's like when they were sitting in that blue balcony. That's really when I close my eyes and picture the version of the show I'm watching at that age that I fell in love with. Gene is probably wearing a weird, like, black and white striped cardigan with a navy jacket over it. And Roger is probably wearing like a plain blue cardigan with like a blue jacket over it. And they're sitting in front of, like this weird blue purplish balcony.
Because
wasn't that one called Siskel and Ebert and the Movies? It was like,
well, if we really want to be technical about it, the show was introduced at Disney under the title Siskel and Ebert and the Movies, and after 1 year, they shortened it to simply Siskel and Ebert.
Because they were a brand. They were
exactly like one.
Because I got to see sneak previews because I lived in Illinois, in Chicago. From 1979 through 85. So I got to see them on WTTW, and it really felt like a hometown show because it was. And I really watched them just because, of course, at this time, this was the only time that we could see these clips from the movies. right? They weren't anywhere else. And so
well, you talk about that in the book, how they got their clips, which is fascinating. This is before EPKs. Maybe you can talk about how they would literally, watch a screening, tell their assistants what clips they wanted, and then arrange to have the clips from the movies.
Yes. So, like I was describing the world where I found the show, which was like 600 millennia ago, and I'm describing a world where the internet is AOL, chat rooms. Now we're talking about 15 years or more before that. And so now we're in a world of, zero internet at all. And there's barely anything, videotape is like a cool new idea. VHS does not exist yet. And
well, there really isn't any entertainment television. It was before Entertainment Tonight and those kind of shows too, right?
Yes.
But there was That's Hollywood with Tom Bosley.
Right.
I remember that.
So there's some, and there are scattered film critics in a couple of like local news stations giving like film reviews or filing film, news reports on the nightly news. The Today Show had Gene Shalit, but the two review thing, that was really their innovation. But in any event, they the thing that the show really innovated, besides having two guys yell at each other about movies, was there's no internet. There's no way to, outside of a movie theater, really, there's no way to see trailers and clips from movies unless maybe you'll see a commercial on TV here or there. And so that was one of the things that the people who first started the show really thought this would be valuable and people would be interested in, is if we did a TV show where people talked about the movies and you could see clips from them. And because this is predating, as you mentioned, the era of EPKs, electronic press kits, where now every movie these days in 2024, every movie, comes with, a bunch of clips that if you work in the TV industry or online and YouTube, whatever, here's a clip you can show. Here's 6 clips you can show. Here's the trailer. And that just didn't exist back then. And so what they would do is when Gene and Roger would go to a screening, they would bring someone from the show with them, a production assistant, a producer, and their job would be to sit next to them with a notepad, a pencil, and a stopwatch, because the other thing to keep in mind is they had to keep track of where in the movie they were, because the films are being projected on film, big, huge honking reels of 35 millimeter film, and they have to be paying attention to reel changes and things like that. So like the cigarette burns you used to see in the top right corner every so often during a movie, that was indicating that there was a change of reels. So they had to basically keep track of all that, while occasionally Gene or Roger would shout out, "This scene, I want this scene, write down this scene." And they would have to write down whatever they were watching and roughly where in the reel they were and what reel they were in. And then they would, after the movie was over, they would take the physical reel of film, just the part that they wanted to use. Somehow they were allowed to do this. They would schlep it in Chicago in the winter, in the snow, to a transfer house, copy the scene they wanted, and then they had to bring the production assistant had to bring the fakakta reel all the way back to where they found it. Wow. It is an unbelievable, just that any studio would allow anyone to like handle their prints, pick out what scene they wanted to show. Would never happen today in a million years. So it's just kind of insane that it did happen. But again, it's so long ago now. It's 40 plus years ago. It really is like a totally different movie universe that this happened in.
So could you argue that experience in a way helped create EPKs, the need for EPKs, so that entertainment journalists would have these clips available?
I don't know if we want to give them total credit. There were other shows that started to crop up, and, TV covering movies became more and more popular. We mentioned Entertainment Tonight, and soon a lot of TV stations, even, little stations all over the country, had their own film critic, would send a film person to junkets. So there were more needs to do EPKs. But I do think that the show absolutely helped popularize that kind of stuff on television. And so in that way, it was responsible for it. And I also think eventually the studios were like, why are we letting these two guys in Chicago pick out whatever scene they want from our movies? This is ridiculous. Right. And so they began by putting out the EPKs, they could control more what was being seen, because that's their job. I mean, it's frustrating when you're on the other end of it, but I understand it. Of course, your job is to sell the movie, and you're going to let these two dudes in Chicago show the worst scene in your movie? No, of course not. You want them to only be allowed to show the best scenes, or the scenes that you think are the best or that are most indicative. And of course, they were so good at what they did, they could turn that around. They could do a review where they're like, and it was not that uncommon that they would do this. They would say, look, we want to show you the scene from this movie that's this, but the studio won't let us. They only want you to see this scene. Now think about why they would not let us show this. Perhaps that could be some indication of the quality of this motion picture. Think about why you think they might not let us show the clip we want. Okay, now let's go look at the clip that they want to show. They would do things like that. They were savvy. They were smart guys, and they were good at, using the medium of television to as part of the critique, and that's the thing. When people sometimes say to me, like, wasn't this really dumbing down film criticism? Didn't this ruin film criticism? I always say no. I always say, like, the
shows that followed did. When you had Jeffrey Lyons and when
Michael Medved
and Michael Medved and everyone that took over after they abandoned a show. And right. I love that you cover that in depth in the book, because so often when people talk about Siskel and Ebert, they never talk about the what they left in their wake. And those shows were unwatchable after they left. They made it look effortless, so everyone thought they could do it, but they couldn't. People couldn't. They
kind of like and the Dukes of Hazzard, when Bo and Luke had to take a season off because the contract dispute, and the Duke cousins came in.
Exactly
and
what
they were
it was.
Blonde and brunette, but they just weren't the same.
Right. Yeah, I think in the book I compare it to some of the later iterations of the Three Stooges. They would always find people who kind of looked like them. Yeah. And could do the same shtick, but it just the magic wasn't there.
Who was the little guy with the mustache? Bill or what was his name?
Oh, Bill Harris.
Bill Harris.
Harris. Yeah. Yep. He was
on
one.
See him at USC, and he used to show up at Norris Theater sometimes.
Yeah, he was one of the replacements on the Tribune, that second version of the show. Yeah.
I thought it was interesting when they brought in Ernie and Bert to do a couple episodes. At first, I didn't realize it.
Thumbs down, Ernie.
Siskel and Ebert did appear. They have a very funny appearance on Sesame Street. That's right. You can find on YouTube, where they explain thumbs up, thumbs down, and then someone says, like, well, what about thumbs in the middle? And they're like, what? No, it cannot be.
I have a theory that one of the reasons people are still so fascinated and why they are so unique in the annals of film criticism is because their relationship echoed the movies. It was a screwball comedy. They started out hating each other and kept trying to screw each other over. There's some great stories that you have in the book about, like, when he's going to interview somebody and Siskel cancels the interview, so Ebert can't do the interview. I mean, it's like a classic screwball comedy. And by the end of the movie, they've fallen in love, right? Not they love each other. They have tremendous respect for each other, and there's a tremendous friendship there. It's such a great arc. It's a better movie certainly than anything Roger Ebert ever wrote, and movies he ever wrote. In the case of Beyond the Valley of the Dolls, but it's really just an amazing story. How to see how they were so concerned, whether it be on Letterman, whose name goes first on the marquee on the show, who is closer to David Letterman. So many great stories, and as that kind of evolved over time, but it never completely went away.
Yeah, I mean, and I think another way of kind of putting what you're saying is the show, and to the question of, like, well, there were all these other knockoffs and iterations and copycats. Why didn't it work? The show had drama. It had tension. Siskel and Ebert did when they were doing their show, because, as you said, and it's correct, they really, in the beginning, they did not like each other. It was not a put on. It was not an act. No one was saying from off camera, Gene, can you act like you're angry at Roger in this take? Can you be a little meaner? If anything, it was the opposite. It was people telling them, Gene, you got to relax. You got to calm down just a little bit. Ease off. You know, like, guys, we're never going to finish this episode if you don't stop yelling at each other. Like, the vibe was that.
Except that is the episode. It's like conflict is the heart of drama. Even
right,
when you're
exactly.
just talking about drama.
Exactly. And that's the thing is, like, the copycats, you can tell two people to sit in a movie theater and, you know, argue about a movie, but you know, they're not going to have that emotional baggage that these two guys had coming out of Chicago, being rivals at rival newspapers who had been competing with each other for 6 years before they ever worked on the show together. And they brought all of that to the set and wanting to beat each other. And yes, they absolutely grew to like each other somewhat, love each other somewhat, respect one another certainly, but like they never fully let go of like this MFer had just screwed me over so many times back then, and now he's trying to screw me over on camera, and I'm not going to let him do that to me while all these people are watching. And it was genuine. They didn't have to fake it. And so all those other people, even some very talented film critics who did it, A.O. Scott and Michael Phillips and these guys who were talented. And in some of these cases, you know, when they're taking over after, you know, Ebert unfortunately gets sick, he can't speak anymore. He leaves the show. You know, A.O. Scott told me, I interviewed him for the book. He said Roger would send him emails saying, you guys are too nice. You're getting along too much. You have to fight more. That's what makes the show work, is that drama. Mm-hmm. And A.O. Scott, you know, he would say to me, like, that wasn't us. Like, we had strong opinions, but we liked each other. If any, they maybe they liked each other too much. They respected each other almost too much. And that was maybe the difference, or one of the differences, and why their show worked so well and so many other shows kind of just flopped.
What you're talking about, it's the same as Richard Roeper after Siskel passes away, and Richard Roeper and Ebert are terrible together. And he's great with his interviews with you. I mean, I thought Roeper was very candid, and he respected Ebert too much. You know, he just was genuflecting too much. It was a mismatch. You know, Ebert was the 10-ton gorilla, and Roeper just didn't belong on the same screen as him. And so it's so interesting to see just, you know, that alchemy, that unique alchemy that Siskel and Ebert had. And I think, you know, sort of forged because they went through it all together. And that's what they said they always had in common, I guess. It's having gone through that process of the failed pilot and watching it evolve. And I mean, that whole story, and maybe you can share that wonderful story about how they end up leaving Tribune for Buena Vista when they're in the midst of renegotiating their Tribune deal.
Yes, so that was right. So that's they leave PBS, they go to Tribune, and they're making pretty good money, and they're a success. And then the contract, I think it was a 4-year contract, and it's starting to come up, and they're trying to renegotiate with Tribune and get a new deal, and Tribune is kind of dragging their heels. And I guess at some point there was a contract like written up, but it was never signed. And, you know, like they keep asking for it, at least as the story has been told, you know, through the years, and was told to me by, you know, people who worked on the show. You know, they're asking for their new contract from the executive producer of the show, this guy, Joe Antello, who was the one who first brought them in. And he was, I think his telling of the story, because there's a bit of Rashomon here where everyone remembers these things differently, you know, in hindsight. But in his telling, he wants to get them on board for another contract, but his bosses at Tribune, you know, whoever's running the company, hasn't signed the deal. It's like sitting on a desk somewhere. And then they go together, Siskel, Ebert, and Antello, with the show to this thing called NatP, which was like the annual syndication convention where people who syndicated TV shows and the channels that buy those shows, they would all get together in a hotel somewhere and schmooze and make deals and all this kind of thing. I'm sure Star Trek was a big presence at NatP. There's no question. Like, that must have been a huge thing for them back in that day. It was during the Next Gen era, yeah. I'm sure, yeah. So they would go every year, and it was their job. It was part of their job to go and just schmooze and be seen and be Siskel and Ebert and, you know, and promote the show. And they went down there without a signed contract for the next upcoming season. And, you know, they went, and supposedly, as the story goes, it was Gene Siskel bumped into this guy who he knew from CBS in Chicago. They had worked together at the local CBS station years earlier. And this guy was now an executive at Buena Vista. And they just bumped into each other like in the elevator bank. And he said, well, how are you guys doing and what's new? And they were catching up because they were like old friends. And he was like, they have us down here and we don't have a contract. And make me an offer kind of a thing. And the guy was like, oh yeah, exactly. You're twiddling your fingers. And like literally, or like the dollar signs were going off over the executive's head. And he said, I will be in touch with you very quickly, very soon. And Siskel walked off. And so now I'm speaking to Jamie Bennett. This is the guy who was the executive is telling me this story. I spoke to him for the book. He says that Siskel walks off and the elevators open again a minute later. And now Jeffrey Katzenberg walks out of the elevator. And Jeffrey Katzenberg is the head of Disney. And Jamie Bennett says, Siskel and Ebert don't have a contract right now. We should hire them for our new syndication division, which was like just getting off the ground.
Yeah.
And Katzenberg says, get it done, make a deal. And, that was it. They signed basically before the convention was over, under the noses of Tribune,
who paid for them to be there.
They had basically finished the deal, like in principle, to leave Tribune to go to Disney. And the punchline that Jamie Bennett told me was his flight home to LA was like I think the convention was in New Orleans, so it was like a flight home with a stop in Chicago. And he wound up sitting on the plane next to like the head of Tribune, and he knew who he was. And I guess the guy from Tribune didn't know who he was. And he said, I'm sitting next to this guy all the way back to Chicago. I think the quote he said was something like, and I just picked his pocket and he didn't even know it, or something like that. And when he told me this story, he has this huge smile on his face,
That's great. That's great. Well, I think also, maybe one of the reasons people are so fascinated by them still is because now in an age where everything's so polarized, and particularly on the internet, where people just, if you disagree, they you think they feel like they're being insulted and they don't want to. These guys disagreed all the time, and as a viewer at home, you could disagree with them and still love them as critics, or and you would listen to them. They curated stuff for you. You say, "Oh my God, I never heard of Hoop Dreams. I'm going to go see Hoop Dreams or Run Lola Run or one of these movies because they said it was great." And if they disagreed with you, about something, it didn't matter if you did, and they had fun disagreeing with each other. Now we're in a completely different world, and it was so fun. After I finished your book over the holidays, I went on YouTube and started watching a bunch of old episodes I hadn't watched in years. A lot of early 80s, mid 80s, especially some of the Dogs of the Year, their Best of the Year, if we pick the Oscars. And then, which is all charming and wonderful. And then I watched, which I guess I had never seen it. I don't know how I missed it, right after Gene had died. And even today, it packs such a wallop. It's so emotional because, it was so sad. Gene died so young. And, he was a fixture in all our homes every week. And then to compound that, what happened to Roger? I mean, it's just so horrifying because these were two like avuncular, wonderful people. And, it just goes away, the death of 1,000 cuts. And it's hard to believe. And it's hard to believe that people don't know who they are now because they were so, and I hate this word, it's so overused, but in this case, it's true, iconic.
Oh yeah, they were definitely iconic. Yeah, it's a bummer because the book and the story of Siskel and Ebert in general is like really fun. You can tell like the stories. There's it's a great mix of like showbiz stories and this passion for movies. It's a great era for movies that the show covers. The last quarter of the 20th century. So you get to talk about great movies. And, if you're, one of the fun things to me doing the research for the book was I was watching those reviews that you're talking about. And then I'll go, I got to rewatch this movie. I got to rewatch that movie. I've never seen this movie. I got to go see this movie. This movie sounds so great. And there'd be movies I'd never even heard of. And I'd go watch them and I would fall in love with them. And that's why the book has an appendix of like kind of the buried treasures of Siskel and Ebert, these movies that they love that have kind of been forgotten.
I think that's their greatest legacy. I think their advocacy for movies that you may not have heard of that would inspire a viewer to check something out.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, and again, going back to me as a 13-year-old, like, they are the reason that I fell in love with movies in general. And then in specific movies, they would talk about it on the show. They would mention a movie, the home video segment, they would mention an old movie, and I would go, oh, 12 Angry Men. That sounds pretty cool. I'm going to go see if Blockbuster has it. And they, in their tiny classic section, maybe they would actually have that movie and 4 other movies, and I would, see them.
Right.
And that was how I started falling in love with older movies as a 13-year-old dork who didn't have enough dorky things to consume himself with. Now I'm watching old movies thanks to Siskel and Ebert. Or they would they would review, new movies that I couldn't see. But then I would keep lists of like, well, I have to see when this movie comes out on video, I have to see it. Or if I was lucky and I was traveling and I happened to be somewhere with an art house theater. Oh, look, this theater's showing that movie Train Spotting. I heard them talking about it on the show. I got to see this movie. Like I have tons of stories like that. And they were advocates is a perfect word for it.
Absolutely. And as you say, they became the conduit to so many movies that people wouldn't necessarily have exposure to. And between that and the fact that there were old movies running on TV at the time, back in the 70s and 80s, that's something that we just don't have now. And I think that the great tragedy is that a lot of those movies that we were exposed to when we were growing up, just no one will give the time of day anymore. And I think that's really sad, and it's a lost facet of having these guys out there banging the drums for things.
Yeah, and I mean, as someone who does this for a living, like one of the things that, again, watching the show now, revisiting it for the book, that I really appreciated was, the show was 20-something minutes every week. And, the reviews are not going to be the most in-depth because they can't be, because they're covering 4 or 5 movies in 20-something minutes. But the nice thing about the show was, they weren't just saying, well, here's the big movies that are playing all over the country this week. Certainly they covered those movies too. Right. And in any given week, you're going to get like the 1 or 2 big new movies that they think either are good enough to talk about, or so many people are going to see them that they're going to want to know what we think and whether they should go. They're debating them to go see them. But then they would have those 2 or 3 other movies that were determined sort of by like, what do we think is important? Right. They were covering things not because they were going to get great ratings, but because they thought they were interesting or notable, or the director was someone worth keeping an eye on, or there was a great performance in this movie, or it's on a subject that's relevant to our viewers. It's about some issue that's plaguing the world right now. We want to talk about it, These days, like there's more people writing and talking about movies than ever before, there's no amount of discussion that you can find in podcasts, on YouTube, online, social media. But so much of it is like focused on, well, what's going to get traffic? What's going to get clicks? What's going to get the most views? What's going to key into the algorithm? What's trending? And everyone is just chasing that. So it's going to end up being the big movies, the Marvel, Star Wars. And I don't have anything. I love those movies. I'm wearing a Spider-Man t-shirt, for God's sakes. I wrote a book about Spider-Man. I love that stuff. But it is so much harder to also cover the little stuff, to cover it all. And that's the thing. It's like when we talk about, oh, well, I watched the show and I fell in love with movies. It was like, it really was a great like intro to film in that way, because you didn't just learn about the big, movie that was coming out that week. You learned about the interesting little indie film, and the film that, somebody made for $20,000, and the film that came from England this week, and the director is suddenly the hot stuff in Hollywood. Like it was incredibly informative, while it was also dramatic because they were yelling at each other the whole time. So it really was a great show. And, like people ask about like, did you really go and watch all these episodes? And was that hard? I'm like, it wasn't. I was the best part. I gave myself license to watch hundreds of hours of this really fun and entertaining and educational show. And it made me just reminded me why I loved it in the first place. And, you know, like when people say, oh, I loved the book, and then I went and watched the show on YouTube, it's pretty good. I'm like, yeah, no kidding. It's good. That's why I wrote a book about it. It's a great show. And it's, you know, so in some ways it is dated, but it's almost like better in that sense because it's a great time capsule now.
It's like a snapshot of that era.
Yeah, it's like 1,000 snapshots of that era of the movies and of America and pop culture. And you turn on any random episode on YouTube, you're gonna find out like what was the big new movie that week? What was the little movie that was interesting? What were on the Oscars that year? Or what were movie lovers pissed off about at that point? Or what was the issue that was people were talking about? It's like, it's a great way to kind of dip your toe into what was going on at any point between like 1975 and 1999.
I think they missed an opportunity to license a briefcase with the drink holder and the popcorn box holder.
Yeah,
they didn't really sell. You know, it's you're joking, but like just think about how much money they could have made like licensing. Yeah. Like nowadays. There would be, you know, like foam finger thumbs and, you know, Siskel and Ebert swag. Like they did almost nothing like that. And it was, you know, like I think at that era, they, you know, they in that day and age, selling out was, you know, especially for a film critic, but you can't sell out. You know, they famously turned down offers, you know, potentially $1 million offers to do like commercials, and they didn't want to sell out. They didn't want to like lose their image of objectivity. Nowadays, no one would care. They would be like, just take the money, just do it. And how do I buy a Siskel and Ebert, you know, beer koozie or whatever? They could market, they would make so much money doing that now. Nobody cares. Selling out, that's the whole point now.
Yeah, it was so great because, you know, on the local news, they would usually review the big marquee value blockbuster that came out that week. But I think what was so great about Siskel and Ebert was they not only reviewed the blockbusters and the big movies, but they would also, like you said, they shined a light, but also a lot of schlock. You know, they have the dog of the week, the skunk of the week, all that stuff, which was great. And as much, and in a sense, they never condescended to it. Like, you know, Pauline Kael might have liked De Palma or, you know, Vincent Canby in the Times, but they weren't known for like doing these schlocky movies. And Siskel and Ebert had no problem covering so many of these. Like, I remember they hated Silent Night, Deadly Night, but they would cover them. They would review them, and you would find out about these movies, you know, and it was great. And I think as entertaining as their best of the year shows were, their worst of the year shows were even more entertaining because they were so funny. And you saw that on Letterman and Carson later.
Yeah. I think that the big difference to me between them and say the Pauline Kaels of the world is that Pauline Kael is a film critic, and Siskel and Ebert were at the movies, right? They're movie critics, and there's something very, and I think you kind of hit on it, Mark. It's there's something very working class and very meat and potatoes about Siskel and Ebert, and I don't mean that as pejorative at all. I mean that in the sense that they spoke about movies in a language that we understood and that we cared about. They spoke about movies that we cared about. They made the movies, even movies that didn't work, they made the movies feel exciting. They made it feel like an adventure to go see a movie. Whereas, you know, you read, I mean, look, obviously you got to respect Pauline Kael, but you read those reviews and you feel like you're going to a class, like something is being picked apart by a professor, which I guess on some level it sort of is, and it makes it feel inaccessible. Siskel and Ebert, whether they gave it thumbs up or thumbs down, made movies feel accessible and great, like we could love them, you know, and that I think it's a special thing.
And I think they also did a great job of putting the films in context of, you know, of the genre, or that, you know, they were often good at saying like, this film may not be a great, you know, film in the history of cinema, but it works, you know, for the type of film it is. It's successful. It successfully tells, you know, this story, and is entertaining and well made for what it is. It's not some absolute scale where this is, you know, crap or genius.
Kind of depended on who you were talking to, which is that was sort of fun because they would sort of argue about exactly what you're talking about too. You know, like what you're describing was very much the Roger Ebert approach to it. Was like, yeah, is this movie Citizen Kane? No. Is it a okay 3-star mild thumbs up movie? Sure. And sometimes Siskel would agree, and sometimes Siskel would say, well, no, why shouldn't we compare it to Citizen Kane? He would often, when they were reviewing a movie, say, oh, this movie doesn't do anything new. This movie doesn't push the medium forward. This movie doesn't, I knew every single thing that was going in. And Roger would sometimes say, Gene, it's a thriller. People go to see it because they know everything that's going to happen. They want to see what they're familiar with. This is that kind of movie. There's it's delivering what people expect and want out of it. That's the point of it, Gene. And he would, and so that's another way that the show was kind of fun, is that they would disagree about what makes a good movie or a bad movie. And so you would sort of get that side of it as well. Look, I have Pauline Kael and Andrew Sarris books on my bookshelf. Not as many as I have Roger Ebert, admittedly, but I love reading their stuff too. I feel like maybe, but what you're saying I don't think is entirely wrong. I do think that Siskel and Ebert, while they did take movies very seriously, they didn't take themselves seriously. Right. At all, and that's how they could go on Letterman and Carson and Leno and Conan and just be, silly and make fun of themselves and do parodies of themselves. And you didn't necessarily see Pauline Kael spoofing herself on Letterman, or, if she had been invited, she wouldn't have been, shooting free throws to determine which movies were good and bad, which was something that Siskel and Ebert did once with Letterman. Yeah. It was just a different vibe, not necessarily a better or worse, but it was definitely different. And yes, Siskel and Ebert, they love to make. I mean, the early days of the show on PBS, they had a whole segment, the Dog of the Week, later the Stinker of the Week, where they were just, it wasn't even really like a question of thumbs up or thumbs down. It's like, these are all bad. We're just going to make fun of them. Right. Watching those episodes, I was wondering if the MST3K guys were in some ways influenced by this, because they're not even reviewing the movies. They're sometimes just showing clips, and they're sitting in a theater and then they're making fun of them. It really is almost like proto Mystery Science Theater, those segments in some ways.
Well, the book is Opposable Thumbs, How Siskel and Ebert Changed Movies Forever, from Matt Singer, and it gets a big thumbs up from all of us. It's a terrific book. It's a great look back at these two magnificent film critics that were so much a part of, certainly of Gen X and growing up, watching them first on PBS and later in syndication. And just remarkable story, and it's extremely well told by Matt. Do you know what you're doing next, or you taking a well-deserved break?
Well, I have a day job running a website, so there's no breaks. But in terms of another book, I'm working on a few ideas. Nothing set in stone yet. So we'll see what happens. I haven't had my wife say, if you don't do this book, you're an effing moron yet. We haven't crossed that bridge so far. Well, yeah, I'm waiting for her to really figure it out for me. So I need her to hurry up, because I'd like to start on a new project pretty soon.
Fantastic. Well, Matt, thank you for joining us, and good luck with the book. Will there be a paperback version? Do you know? Because the hardcover came out last fall.
Yeah, I can't say with 100% certainty. There is supposed to be, and I would assume, I don't have a date or anything, but I would assume, given how the book is done, it's going to hopefully, knock on wood, will happen. And I would assume hopefully sometime in the fall. Yeah, that will take place.
And there is
you can still get the hardcover right now, and you can get the ebook, and you can get the audiobook version. You can get it all right now. Why wait until the fall?
The audiobook version is very engaging. That's how I inhaled the book, and it's very exciting and well worth the listen.
And voiced by me too. So
indeed,
if this wasn't enough of my hideous voice, if you need 8.5 more hours of this, if nothing sounds better than listening to this voice talk for 9.5 hours, There you go. The audiobook is for you.
And there's still the digital Kindle version as well. If you don't want to hear that voice.
If you don't want to hear this wonderful, mellifluous voice, you can read it. Yes, you can actually physically read it or read it on a Kindle or whatever.
Fantastic. Well, Matt, thank you so much, and continued success with the book.
Thanks, guys. It was a lot of fun.
And for now, the balcony is closed.
Ah.
Well, I thoroughly enjoyed that. Obviously, I'm a fan of the book. I'm a huge fan of Siskel and Ebert. Big 2 thumbs up from Darren. Oh man, all four of us
all in agreement.
And
eight thumbs up. 8 thumbs up.
I don't know if you guys were watching the Zoom feed entirely, but at one point, like I think Darren made a thumbs up gesture.
Well,
and
I made the gesture by accident. I was crossing my arms.
That's no
it was glorious. And the and the automatic
Those are 2 pillows.
The automatic emoji generator put up a thumbs up.
Oh, that's funny. Well, this is really fun, and I'm so glad to hear see their legacy continue to be carried on by a younger generation, because he was considerably younger than us, even younger than Ashley, and it was the same thing with the Roger and Gene podcast that I so enjoyed a couple of a year ago. And of course, we did a big a lot on Siskel and Ebert in our documentary Greatest Geek Year Ever 1982, because I felt it was really important. That was such an important part of that year, because their episode where they talked about The Thing was hysterical, about how gory it was and how offensive it was, and how and of course Star Trek 2 and Tron, and I mean they had some great. Although it was so interesting to look at their best of the year in retrospect, because virtually none of the movies that we consider classics from that year were on their list. It was Moonlighting, the Jeremy Irons movie, not the Bruce Willis TV show, and Personal Best, and Sophie's Choice, and just a whole bunch of stuff that doesn't even come close to sort of the legends of 82, the giants, if you will.
Harold Robbins.
But I have to say, as entertaining and wonderful as it is, and it had me go back and look at a lot of those David Lettermans, which I think are hysterical. But where it really is gut-wrenching is, when it chronicles the Siskel's cancer, brain cancer, and obviously the throat cancer that Roger Ebert had, and he faced the way Roger. I mean, and I saw the documentary about him, obviously, which is wonderful, and read a lot of his book, but the way he faced it with good. He never lost his zest for life and his passion for movies, even, as he lost his jaw and his ability to speak and communicate. I mean, it's just remarkable. I mean, he was extraordinary. Roger was an extraordinary man. And I think the book, sort of captures some of that. And it's just a really sad coda to, a life well lived for both of them. But anyway, I'm so glad we had a chance to dive in this week. And of course, that's what we do every other week on our pop culture podcast, Deck 78, from your friends at 430 Movie and Inglorious Treksperts. We'll be back in 2 weeks with an all new episode, which are only available through a subscription. So we hope you'll do that. And of course, enjoy our free podcasts available wherever you listen to podcasts, including 430 Movie, Inglorious Treksperts, and now you can hear Darren Doctorman and friend on
Kirk Thatcher.
Kirk Thatcher on the Weirded Beardos, his new podcast.
That's
and
every week, Monday mornings.
Every Monday morning. So make that an appointment when you wake up and having a tough time getting up after a long weekend. At least
wake up with the Beardos, whether you want to or not.
Well,
look forward
here's
to
a weird morning. Oh, hey guys, is it Monday again?
And if you want to share your thoughts about Siskel and Ebert, you can do that on social at 430 Movie Pod or Inglorious Trek, Inglorious Treksperts on any of your favorite social channels, or most of them. We're still not on Friendster, but until we join you again here on Deck 78, on behalf of Steve Melching, Ashley Edward Miller, Darren Doctorman, and myself, Mark A. Altman, fire the rockets.
Deck 78 is an exclusive podcast from Treksperts Plus.